We'll be giving 2 more minutes just out of courtesy to give our colleagues time to log in, and then we'll begin.
Estupendo, colegas. Pues yo creo que tenemos ya un número de participantes.
Wonderful. I think we have a considerable number of participants in the room. Thank you everyone for coming into this space. It's a pleasure to see so many panelists as well. Today we have a very interesting agenda order of the day to follow, but a very tight one at that. So if it's all right with you, let's begin with this meeting. It is 10:05 Panama time. Second block, dear colleagues, of the learning cycle and social protection systems. We have a couple of hours from here on till noon to talk about very interesting topics pertaining to this cash and voucher assistance with social protection components in the time of an emergency in terms of addressing how we can support these systems. On behalf of the OCHA regional office, I would like to welcome everyone. I am Amaya Lopez. I will be participating and providing you with some information at the beginning of this webinar. I will not take up too much of your time. I just wanted to, first and foremost, welcome everyone. Second, thank all of our panelists and participants, and thank you for both groups who are in the platform, who are here to address CVAs and social protection and how we can better help the people in need. So thank you everyone who got involved in organizing this webinar. And if it's all right with you, let's move on to our presentation.
Language. You just go to the interpretation button and at the screen. You will see now at the at the screen. Si prefieren escuchar la presentación en inglés, tenemos interpretación. Pueden ir a la...
Once again, if you'd like to listen to the presentation in English, you can resort to the interpretation option on the lower part of your screen. So, without further ado, let's begin with the second block of this learning cycle on cash and voucher assistance and its ties to social protection. I say second block because if you remember, some of you participated last week. We had a first part of this learning cycle where we spoke about cash and voucher assistance in terms of before an emergency. So I've already thanked all involved in this webinar. I'm going to go by very quickly because today's order of the day, today's schedule is very tight, and I don't want to take up time away from the panelists. After my greetings, we'll go to Jimena Peroni so that she can give us a recap of day one that was held last week. We focused on the before in terms of having cash and voucher assistance ready to respond. Today, we're going to address the use of cash and voucher assistance during an emergency. Upon a crisis, we're going to try to provide you with some tips in terms of how to better use these programs, this cash and voucher assistance, upon an emergency. We have a prepared slide, dear colleagues, who are sharing their screen. Have today's goals. We have, like I said, 2 hours for this webinar to promote dialogue between all different stakeholders pertaining to cash and voucher assistance, sharing experiences and learning collectively to identify certain tips and pieces of advice so that we can better apply this kind of program. Next slide, dear colleagues, please. Okay, so let's get into substance. We use CVAs during emergency situations, whether they are prolonged crises or sudden impact emergencies. And at our organization at a global level and from the perspective of different humanitarian organizations is that the use of CVAs has increased progressively through time. I think that in the first webinar that was held in 2021 during the pandemic response, and from then on until today, we have seen an increase in the use of these programs during emergencies, during disaster situations. And at a global level, its use has doubled. Since 2015, its use has doubled in terms of our responses to emergency situation. There's an approximation in terms of our calculations that says that it is that approximately 19% of humanitarian assistance is used for these programs through these modalities. We haven't yet reached the percentage of use that we would like to have for these programs, although we have committed in different spaces for that. But I think that we're well on our way. And I think that's one of the good news at a global level. Now, focusing on our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, what we have observed in the last few years is that indeed the use of this modality of these programs has increased. As I mentioned, at our regional office based here in Panama, we have seen how we're using CVAs more and more to respond to emergency and disaster situations. We have examples in terms of our responses to ETA and IOTA, our tropical storms that happened in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, and how we use cash and voucher assistance to reach that sector of the population that required help at those times. We've also seen in the last few years how these programs are used more and more to address prolonged crises, such as the migration situation in our region, migrants or people requesting asylum who are going through the region to up north. And we've seen how CVAs can be a good program that can help them recover in terms of certain needs that they might have during their journey. So once again, we're using this kind of program, this modality more and more. And one of the reasons for this is because providing cash or coupons to people who are in a vulnerable situation instead of providing the usual type of assistance, that means that these families or people who have suffered an impact they will be able to decide how to best satisfy their needs. They are at the center of this assistance, of this help provided, which is something that we're always talking about in the humanitarian arena, how to put people first, people at the center. And with this kind of program, they have the power of deciding how to satisfy their most urgent needs, as long as the markets and the operational context allow for that. Next slide.
Aquí me gustaría quizá resumirlo en solo 4 palabras.
Here, I'd like to summarize this in just 4 words, and hopefully, throughout these 2 hours, perhaps we'll be able to reflect a little bit more in terms of these programs. What we've seen is that as humanitarian actors, as humanitarian stakeholders, this allows us for a fast response because we save time in terms of buying and distributing goods. Eh, Assistance can reach people almost instantly. It's an efficient response because it can truly have an impact in the lives of people who are in the most vulnerable of situations, in the most dire situations. So we believe that this allows us to be much more efficient, and that something that the usual kind of assistance doesn't allow for that. It's more affordable because um, this allows us to address things and better distribute our resources, especially in countries such as in Latin America or the Caribbean, where honestly speaking, it's difficult to get there or to send certain kinds of goods, and so this becomes more affordable. And finally, it's flexible. This allows us to assess the response and the impact of our response, and in a way, redirect that response. For me, these are the 4 goals that could summarize cash and voucher assistance. Um, like I said, we're a bit tight in terms of time, so I'm going to go over this rather quickly. So the humanitarian program cycle, many of you already know this cycle. This is the cycle that has been established in a natural way in terms of a response to a disaster situation. It goes through needs analysis and evaluation, um, strategic planning, resource mobilization, monitoring and implementation, and going over the response and how it went. So for us, this is not only for CVA, but for all transversal aspects that we oversee at our organization. We have the obligation to include in each of these phases of the humanitarian program cycle a response that we can bring to the table in this context in terms of needs and analysis. What should we consider for CVA so that this response can work under this modality? For example, we cannot forget that when we assess needs, we also need to have market analysis. Is the local market working? Is it not working? How can we incorporate the use of cash and voucher assistance, etc.? So we have to analyze all of these aspects during an emergency situation so that we can better plan strategically. We need to know the operational context, where this can work and where it can't. And that way, we go through each phase of the cycle. Resource mobilization. We have our humanitarian financial tools ready to respond in this modality. Some of you might recognize the SURF tool or the CBPF. These tools are ready to go, but we need to ask ourselves all of these questions in the context of CVA so that we can use this throughout the whole humanitarian program cycle. We also have tools ready to get some feedback from the community that we are assisting with this program. And in that way, um, in the future, change or redirect our assistance. So I would like to invite you throughout these 2 hours that we have to not lose sight of this humanitarian program cycle and try to identify in each of the phases how we can better coordinate our assistance through CVAs. And that way we can move forward in the functioning of the humanitarian program cycle so that this assistance can be provided adequately. So this is what I wanted to share with you today. One last element for consideration: strengthening the ties between CVA and social protection, which is the approach that we want to address during this learning cycle. What we're seeking to do is also to strengthen the ties between the humanitarian and development aspects. So we are considering a parallel cycle to the humanitarian actions. Whatever we're doing through CVA also requires further development in other spaces and at other moments, in other time frames that are medium to long term.
Importantes para nosotros en OCHA cuando hablamos
So
de
I wanted to mention these aspects that are significant to us at our organization in terms of cash and voucher assistance. And once again, welcome everyone. I hope you enjoy this space, that we all learn together, that we can share experiences, and I hope that everything will be of interest to you. With this, I give the floor to Jimena Caperoni so that she can give us a recap on the first cycle that was held last week. If there are any questions or comments, please reach out to me.
Gracias. Bueno, si se me escucha bien, en un minuto trataremos de resumir un día muy
Okay, so I hope you can hear me well. I'll take just a moment to summarize. Our first day was held last week. You have access to the recording in both languages via our website. I really recommend that you take a look at that because the idea is to develop this dialogue space during the process of learning about the before, during, and after these situations of disaster or difficult situations. And I want to go back to the before. That represents the need to go back to the basics in terms of social protection, recognizing that this is a human right. It's part of our social reivindication, and that will help us provide better support through different efforts and actions for further financing so that we can actually make better decisions at a specific moment in time. Um, our colleagues from Paraguay were saying that finding each other before, in the before, is of the utmost importance, and that it's very important to recognize the difficulties of the different sectors of the population that we work with, and for us to work with resilient protection systems so that we can support them in difficult times. It was wonderful to listen to them, and it was very enriching, and I hope that you enjoy today. Thank you. Thank you, Jimena and Amaya. It's a pleasure to be with you guys today. Just to begin the first panel, I am Holly Welcome Radice. I'm the regional representative of the CaLP network of the Americas team. I have a wonderful panel ready for you. This includes Megan Donna from the World Food Program. Also, Maureen Tejeda, she is institutional project managers for the Superate program. And we also have with us Scarlett Heredia. She is a sectorial expert on social protection with expertise in France. They will all be talking about the early action context with CVA and social protection for the Dominican Republic. I'd also like to mention that they are represented here as members of the working group on adaptive social protection and not necessarily their organizations. So now let's go to a journey and go to the Dominican Republic and let's analyze this topic from a recent past. First with Megan, then with Maureen, the current situation, and with Scarlett, a vision towards the future. Are you ready? Let's go to the Dominican Republic. Before we begin, I would like to remind our panelists that they only have 6 minutes and they'll know they have 1 minute left because I will turn on my camera. Please speak slowly for interpretation purposes. So let's begin with Megan. Megan, would you turn on your camera and microphone, please? Go ahead.
Saludos, muy buenos días, colegas. Gracias, Holly. Y
Hi,
gracias.
good morning, everyone, dear colleagues. Thank you, Holly, and thank you for giving me this opportunity of sharing the Dominican Republic experience. Early action here in the country context is an early prolonged action that takes years to create a space for social protection. It requires coordination and positioning within the country and the central government so that it can become a viable system of reference in terms of responses with CVA in the face of an emergency. That is why I tend to call this more than an early action. I call it a long-term vision strategy. The Dominican Republic started in the 90s to focus on early action systems for the general population with programs such as Prosole, Progresando con Solidaridad, Progressing with Solidarity. And decades before, we would see programs for police corps, etc. But in the last few years, the government has made efforts to expand even further their social protection scope with a national strategy of social protection, as well as an expansion of cash and voucher assistance through its social protection institutions. They created a state platform through which they make transfers for larger food programs. In 2015 is when they start defining adaptive social protection or reactive or in emergencies, or we use shock responsive in English. Here in the Dominican Republic, we use adaptive social protection to cover all of these. So 2 years afterwards, in 2017, the Dominican Republic became a case study for reactive social protection in Latin America and the Caribbean. This was held by the PMA with OPM Oxford Policy Management. And less than a year after, we're talking about 2018, there was a mission from the headquarters office regarding cooperation and adaptive social protection. They already had developed a social protection strategy, but they furthered it. It was a long mission and there were several recommendations issued. The technical working group on adaptive social protection was created in September 2018 with the leadership and coordination of PMA as a product of the recommendations from this mission, and it pointed out the need to work with the potential and opportunities of training the people in the framework of social protections to provide a response in emergency situations. The purpose was to create an interinstitutional space so that we could develop those methodologies and tools and mechanisms that would allow us to prepare for providing social protection and responding to emergencies in the country. At a very long-term vision perspective, we would integrate in time these programs into the National Prevention, Mitigation, and Response Program.
O más cotidianamente defensa civil.
This is called civil defense here. So that was done through a joint work plan that provided coordination, technical training, and development of methodologies on focalization, distribution, communication, monitoring for social protection programs in emergency situations. It was composed of technical officers representing the different levels of government, as well as technical officers from UN agencies, from UN programs, etc., from the government side when it came to CVA as well as cash and the active members are UNICEF, UNHCR, PMA. Also, the World Bank has been a significant member for who provided a lot of help in this. There was a lot of international cooperation from NGOs. The group has developed several mechanisms and has created documents and tools based on consensus to focus on cash and voucher assistance as a response mechanism for social protection in the Dominican Republic. For example, 5B19 or Recanciona, there are different examples of CVA and how third parties can inject cash into the government platform so that a response can be conducted just like UNICEF did. And with that, we saw the wonderful possibilities in terms of the international community responding to disaster situations. We have several challenges as a group. The work is ongoing still. We are not blind to that. We're not turning a blind eye to that. But as always, there are many lessons to be learned here. What I want to highlight is that this is a long process. A group like this one is our entry point in terms of liaising with government, and that we shouldn't stop or having these sessions or meetings, though they might no longer have political will, etc. We need to maintain a broad group with active participation. In 5 years, and with this I conclude, in 7 years, we've managed to develop that long-term vision, create the group, start knocking on doors, have points of entry into government. So in 7 years, we have signed a working agreement with PROSODE and the National Emergency Commission, and even a legislative reform that considers adaptive social response as social protection within the national legal framework. So we can have a prolonged, long prior response. Thank you.
This is long-term work with different actors that have different roles. And of course, a state investment, which is quite important. As a matter of fact, we have seen the past, and now let's go towards the future. Maureen, you have the floor, please. Well, thank you. And I truly value the introduction that Megan carried out. It will allow us, for all of you, to be able to have a clearer understanding of the realities in the different country concerning adaptive social changes. I'm in charge now of talking about the current situation of these transfer programs and social protection, especially in the same context of adaptive social context. Hence, the institution that I is the institution in charge of implementing a strategy of an integral struggle against poverty in the country with the goal in mind to increase life quality and to promote the autonomy from economic and social perspective of the Dominican families. The work that we have carried out until today has allowed us to have an impact of over 1.5 million families through social protection initiatives, like, for example, monetary transfers. And as a matter of fact, or these cash transfers, let me share with you, and I'm seeing that Isabel is here to sharing her screen, but let me share with you my presentation so that you can have further details. Nonetheless, in spite of the fact that the prior institution represented or carried out different years of management, it's in 2021 with the presidential decree that we have carried out a transformation to social protection base, leaving behind, that ready assistance back then towards the development of human development. In other words, trusting that we can promote within these families precisely autonomy, and for these to have the means to improve their life quality. And that is when we call the program Superate, Overcome. That's a different name from before, and it's precisely with the degree that we create this emergency bond as a contingency towards this adaptive social protection to mitigate the impacts when emergency circumstances take place. And this tool is a change. It's a watershed concerning adaptive social protection in the country, because the regulations that exist concerning the risk of management does not take into account civil protection and social protection. However, since the enactment of this decree, we have been carrying out different actions hand in hand with civil protection. And like Megan, she represents the program with one of the main alliances and others, so as to be able to promote these articulated actions. As a matter of fact, to delve into this subject matter, it's important to how bonus and its implementation works. It consists of 3 stages. First, the emergency declaration. Well, on the field, the emergency basic fee, it's called, this is how it's called. We compile information concerning the levels of issues concerning physical structures, as well as in the life quality and issues concerning that household. And the second stage is an analysis, and we organize the households based on the issues that they have gone through. So when this is approved, when these households eligible, well, we issue this payment system, and at the same time, we transfer the money. Now, in September last, back in 2022, many of you might know that Fiona, this hurricane, reached the country in the Caribbean Ocean. And as a matter of fact, it struck us specifically in our country. So we needed an immediate response of the government in those affected communities. From Superate, we prioritized back then which were those provinces that had been declared as emergency, which were the most affected ones. And as a matter of fact, we established legibility criteria. For example, they decided who these individuals were. They had to have a proper ID. Maybe these were people from other nationalities, because for them to be able to obtain these cash transfers from the Dominican Republic, especially in terms of social protection, you need your ID card. And as a matter of fact, you have to prove through the system that they had been affected by Fiona, the hurricane. Cash assistance of more or less $89, and they will be carried out according to the level of issues faced. So they would receive 2 consecutive months of these fees. If it's a moderate issue, 2 consecutive months as well. And finally, those with a high total issue, well, as well, 2 consecutive of fees. So we learned many lessons since then, and let me address these very briefly. We use different payment means. We guarantee interoperability amongst different agencies. We worked as a center of a transparency policy, protocols of other matters, priorities. We created a framework concerning the emergency bonus, and also we adapted in the obtention process based on the needs that we found, as well as technical training that we offer to our teams, and to take care of the shelters, searching for people that were in need, and finally, communication improvements with our beneficiaries for these to be able to check through these digital systems the consultation of these fees. This is how this took place. Well, thank you, Maureen. As a matter of fact, we saw in action what happened with all these plans. In other words, they were able to take advantage of these matters to be able to obtain these fees. But we have another vision towards the future. So now Scarlett will be addressing this subject matter. Her experience and the architecture that we have in the Dominican Republic, where are you addressing all these things? Well, maybe the beach, but besides the beach, where are we going towards with this topic? Well, good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so glad to be part of these panels that addresses the role of social protection when responding to a crisis. Well, thank you, Holly. Thank you to the organizers. As a matter of fact, I will be addressing the perspectives of the Dominican Republic beyond going to the beach. Well, taking into account the gaze or the look of the project of strengthening the social protection and health systems, well, this is a project that has been the result of a donation of funds from the European Union through the French Development Agency. And it was implemented under the Expertise France, to which I belong. This is a French cooperation agency from France and a key operator that designs and implements projects that strengthen in a sustainable manner public policies in developing countries and in emerging countries. Hence, this project, whose objective has a vision until 2025, wishes to provide the social protection system and the social protection network towards the strengthening of a better response mechanism. Let me say that when we refer to the social protection network, we're talking of 4 main agencies which are the beneficiaries of these projects. The Cabinet of Social Policies, that is the head concerning the coordination on social policies as well. The single beneficiary system, subscribed to the Ministry of Economy, whose ability is precisely what Maureen was saying. In other words, to identify and to categorize and to focalize those vulnerable populations, and the Superate program, which was presented before, and the monetary transfer, or the cash and voucher assistance program of social protection of the Dominican Republic, and the social subsidy agency, who creates and materializes these social subsidies concerning the trustees. Hence, the project concerning the strengthening of the social protection system foresees a specific line, which is the adaptive social protection line, as Megan said. In other words, this is under emergency circumstances, and there are 3 results that we wish to take care under the framework of this project. The first one is to establish and improve assistance measure and response measures to support the vulnerable population and socially affected because of the emergency circumstances. And secondly, to strengthen the management of the risks from a social protection perspective. And thirdly, improve the recovery capabilities, emphasizing on gender and vulnerable youth. Now, before this specifically, we can say that towards 2025, the main product is a public policy tool called Integral Strategy of Social Adaptive Protection. This is a tool which will allow the articulation and coordination and systematization of the hard work concerning social protection in this context, and it'll be accompanied by a funding strategy as well. Now, this is together with the operations that will take place and a risk management social protection program. It's important to underscore that this will allow a proper coordination and a legitimate one as well between the social protection system and the national mitigation, prevention, and response system, because at present there is a coordination, but this will strengthen this exercise. And also, we will see the development of a special module for the monitoring of programs of this nature, and we will increase the interoperability of social protection towards the emergency system. And structurally, we shall be seeing the development of different initiatives. We can quote the automation of the basic aspect that Maureen mentioned, the establishment of a social universal registry. It's called the Single Beneficiary Registry. Therefore, after obtaining all this information, the Dominican state will be able to have the proper data concerning the affected individuals for a better response, and the strengthening of technical aspects and other components. And also, we shall take care the recovery and resilience capabilities, emphasizing on gender and vulnerable youth, as I said before, through specific initiatives linked to training projects, the promotion of enterprises, labor functions, and we're studying an initiative for the establishment of a microcircle project under the leadership of the Superate program and the Oportunidad 1424 program as well. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, when facing 2025, there is much that the Dominican Republic wishes to carry out to be able to carry out and definitely help out from a social perspective that we still have, and as a project we wish to carry out, and as a French agency as well. And this has been done focusing and complementing through synergies in our working group on social protection, with which we began the current panel. And as a matter of fact, we have been collecting and of course, considering the vision of the government, in other words, the development at country level, because we refer to this at the start of these activities. Hence, we definitely have to take into account what the sectors foresee. We understand that the country will truly be able to talk about a strengthening of the system and promote the resilience conditions for the population under vulnerable circumstances or that have been affected when they face an event that degenerates into an emergency. Hence, we're here to help out the country through the cooperation of the European Union, the French cooperation, into account the initiatives of our colleagues, so that the population that truly needs this will be favored. Thank you so much. I hope I was on time. Well, thank you. Yes, you did comply with the time allotted. We have seen the visions in action in the Dominican Republic. There is a change. We will now go on to the Q&A session. And I can see that, yes, there is a question on the chat. Maureen, let me read it out. Maybe those of you wish to hear the question, and which is the following. It has to do with the opening of the government agencies to participate in these initiatives, and which is the strategy in spite of the staff turnover and the opportunities from a sustainable perspective. Maureen, could you explain this a little bit further? I know that you wrote it down. You have the floor. In terms of the government agencies and participating in this initiatives under emergencies, I was saying that the tripod, these are the three institutions that work together to guarantee the social protection system work. Well, we work hard so that these actions are done in an articulated fashion, and to be able to continue with what we have established on paper from a practical perspective. Nevertheless, there are different government agencies that are committed, especially the Ministry of Finance, so as to be able to provide the funds which will be needed under emergency circumstances. And maybe we do not have them available within our budget. But yes, of course, to underscore that there are other international agencies like the World Food Program and others, FAO in other words, and other colleagues that Megan mentioned, which are part of the social protection adaptive table, which are extremely important for this initiative to truly be able to exist through time. In other words, this is what we call work that is accompanied by others. This social protection is not only from the Dominican Republic, I believe it's from all the different countries. Therefore, our commitment is to strengthen all the proper documentation. In other words, the operational manuals based on the presidential degrees, which allow us to activate the work that we are carrying out, and also the different projects and documents, which can be also administrative resolutions. In other words, for these to have strong initiatives and, as a matter of fact, guarantee sustainability, not only for vulnerable populations, but throughout all the social protection initiatives. We have 5 more minutes here, but there are questions on the Q&A. A question is the following. Could you talk a little bit further? How have things taken place concerning the process of the drafting of a national strategy concerning adaptive national protection and funding? Who wishes to address this question? Scarlene, you go ahead. Go ahead. Yes, I can address funding, but concerning the drafting of the initiative, Scarlett and Megan have definitely more experience. Well, here, I'm glad you asked this question. It gives us the chance to be able to be more precise. As a matter of fact, as a project, we're betting on the updating of a draft document. We have one at present. This is a draft document which was which had the support of the World Bank, as Megan said. She's part of the table. This is a proposal that unfortunately, facing 2018, 2019, when it was drafted, it wasn't officialized. And at present, we're working under the light of this project to update it within this context to account the current government and the progress that the system has conquered, like the emergency bonus, and to finish this proposal and for it to be ready, for it to be officialized. Now, concerning the funding of the course of this process, as I said, that the World Bank has supported in an important manner this project with the other cooperatives, as Megan said. They have carried out each and every all the contribution concerning the definitions of protocol and technical assistance, together with Expertise France and the French cooperation. We shall be defining this exercise and its funding strategy as well. The discussions and the content will be the objective of this process, but at least for the official aspect of this document, well, this has been the before and the now. Maureen, do you wish to delve and to address this topic? Just to say that in terms of funding, it's right to say that the government agencies are working on these budgets. They work with a certain percentage or with a certain amount, and it's destined precisely to emergencies. Nevertheless, as it contemplated in this emergency bonus, what will be the magnitude of the event? Well, although we wish to have this emergency fund, it's very difficult. Therefore, at Superate, we have worked with the World Bank so as to be able to have available funds in case of emergency and to be able to use them for these monetary cash and voucher assistance purposes. Unfortunately, I do not wish to go beyond the time allotted, but there are many questions on the Q&A. The colleague that has raised his hand, please jot down your question on the Q&A or the chat, and the colleagues will be able to answer your question. Well, thank you. Thank you. From the Dominican Republic, we're going to go to another location completely. Thank you to the speakers. And now we shall address another topic, which is an example of is an example of a video in English. So please switch to the language of your preference. We shall be addressing an example from the Philippines, and it's adaptive and a shock responsive social protection system in the Philippines. It's important to say that the Philippines is a country subject to 21 hurricanes or typhoons a year. It's definitely exposed to natural crises. Hence, the different stakeholders in the country, the government, FAO, and UNICEF, amongst others, have designed a program which wishes to utilize anticipatory methods, early responses linked to social protection programs. And I had the opportunity to talk with the different stakeholders that are working on this program. So let's listen to what our colleagues in the Philippines have to say. Let's listen to the video.
Thank you so much. Really excited to introduce two panelists that are going to have a short video with us. That is Rosela Akawili, who is a social protection specialist at UNICEF, and Ruth Georgette, who is a social policy and program coordinator at FAO, and both of them are joining us from the Philippines. So maybe just to set a little bit of the scene. So in the Philippines, there's extensive reach of social protection systems. I think you guys would agree. It is also a country that is multi-hazard prone. And in addition to that, we've seen considerable use of cash and voucher assistance in humanitarian settings. But sometimes, in some contexts, we see that there are silos: social protection, humanitarian cash, and early action. I'd really like us to dig in a bit to this initiative that you guys have been working on, which is creating anticipatory actions and really leading to early action facilities. So I'm going to turn to you first, Rosel, and ask you the first question. So what was the problem that you all were trying to solve?
Thank you, Holly, for having us here. We are looking for ways to effectively channel assistance to poor and vulnerable populations in the most efficient and effective way, in a manner that would allow us to reach more beneficiaries quickly and give assistance in a manner ahead of an emergency. Social protection programs potentially offer this opportunity because these programs have a ready infrastructure that one can use, such as social registries, beneficiary lists, payment mechanisms, communication channels to beneficiaries. One can link up to this by either vertically or horizontally expanding these programs as needed.
Interesting, yes, okay. But so the Philippines is a special place from what I said at the beginning, right? So there were some enablers that really helped you to be able to think about this, help you guys to ideate and to find special sauce, should we say. So what was that special sauce that you guys were able to use to move towards this project?
Foremost is that there is an existing large-scale social assistance program in the Philippines. That is the Familia Filipino program, which the UNICEF has been providing policy and operational support for more than a decade. The 4 pieces implemented by the Department of Social Welfare and Development. Our existing partnership with the SWD allows us to support their policy reforms and also introduce innovations such as this. We are piloting this under the Central Emergency Response Fund Anticipatory Action Pilot to link AA interventions to social protection ahead of the landfall of a major typhoon. The AA pilot has not been activated yet, so triggers have not been met the previous years, but the pilot in itself remains active as a project. The idea that we can use this opportunity to look at ways of improving how we do emergency preparedness and response by linking this to social protection also helps reinforce building resilience among the poor and vulnerable populations. We use this opportunity as well to build the evidence, and I think that is one thing that makes it attractive, apart from the intention of providing assistance ahead and reducing the cost of emergency response.
Absolutely. Of course, we want to provide support to the most vulnerable people, but we also want to show how it can be done and how it can be done better. Maybe turning to you, Ruth, now, what are you still trying to project?
In terms of what we're trying to address in this project is really, as Vera said, the scaling up of a humanitarian response to very specific hazards. In the Philippines, we have typhoon, flood, and most recently drought. And having said that, we have not just amongst a list of who are the poor, but also it requires us to identify who are the most vulnerable. Vulnerable to these various hazards. And when we put together these two data sets, we should be able to identify who will be needing the most assistance using government social protection systems. And largely because we have very limited resources, we cannot be able to respond altogether to huge population, but really focus on who will be needing this based in terms of what Rosella was saying, of vertical expansion, topping up an existing database of beneficiaries in the social assistance program, and horizontally looking also at those who will be most affected, especially in an anticipation or in anticipation rather from these various hazards.
Great. No, really important points there. So, this video is being recorded for folks that are mainly working in Latin America and the Caribbean, across the Americas. Also another hazard-prone area, multi-hazard prone. Lots of social protection and a growing use of humanitarian cash as well. But from your perspective, from the Philippines, Ruth, maybe taken from you, what would your advice be for actors in other regions who want to prioritize using early response, anticipatory action, where they're connecting social protection, humanitarian cash? What would be some of your points of advice for them?
Yeah, I think first would be ownership. If we want to tap into social protection systems of existing governments, we need to first and foremost work with government, help them understand and appreciate this concept. In the Philippines, it's still a nascent new concept. It makes sense. But for them to be able to fully understand and own it requires really working with them on a regular basis, as well as explaining it. Ownership is important. They need to be in the driver's seat. Secondly, is coordination. We recognize that in the Philippines, there are various actors, stakeholders who are implementing anticipatory action using cash as a first modality to be able to respond before a disaster. But having said that, you have these INGOs who have already been practicing this. And therefore, the need to be able to coordinate with them and learn from what they're already doing and bring it to government's information, government's conscience, so that they're able to pick up from these lessons and implement it themselves. We at the Food and Agriculture Organization are working closely with the Department of Social Welfare and Development because we recognize that they need to be in the driver's seat to own and lead the coordination within government and across the INGO humanitarian actors. And why is coordination important? Because we want to harmonize our work. We cannot have one INGO or a group of INGOs implementing cash modalities using a different cash transfer value versus government using a different cash transfer value. So in the context of identifying what those modalities are is important and agreeing. So one would be the cash transfer values. Second would be potentially looking at post-distribution monitoring questions that can be consistent as far as learning across INGOs and the government. So these are just simple examples of how we need to really take stock of coordination work in the country across not just government, but also INGOs. And the last is very, I think, to me, very important, the policy and program. If we were to scale up and institutionalize this work of anticipatory action using cash and other cash plus modalities, we need to be able to have both the policy environment, create the environment for governments to take this forward, and we also have to have the programs. Piloting programs at a small scale is important to gather and capture those lessons and feed it back into the design. So this does not happen overnight. It requires really working closely with government, non-government organizations, the UN partners, but also being able to capture these lessons, bring it into a design that makes sense for government, and then revising it. And it really will require cooperation and time to come up with this mainstream pilot with government.
I love it. Policy programs, harmonizing ownership, and looking at the PDMs and transfers. Lots to take into consideration. Rosella, do you want to get the last word on any advice you might have for folks in the region?
Yes, so I think as I mentioned a while ago, let's always try to make sure that we build the evidence base around these numbers, no? Because at the end of the day, if you want government to own up and if you want government to scale this up, you always have to make sure that you also, while doing this, trying to build the evidence along the way, trying to capture the lessons learned, and also trying to understand what works and what doesn't work in the given context.
Absolutely. Evidence is key. Getting to know what works and doesn't. I want to thank you both so much for taking the time to talk with us today. And I think that you really brought some interesting points of view in a cross-regional event. And thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you
Thank
very
you
much,
for
Holly.
having me.
Bueno, yo sé que fue al canal de español, pues es un tema de Zoom que estamos aprendiendo, pero los
Okay, so I know that the Spanish channel was difficult to understand. It was a Zoom issue, but we will be sharing that video with you because it's quite interesting. I'd like to invite my colleague Diego, who will start us off with the next panel. Diego, the floor is yours. Thank you, Holly, and thank you for this invitation to talk about early action and these examples of the Dominican Republic and the Philippines. Let's begin with the second part of the session, which will be focusing on response. For this, as you can see on your screen, you will find cases from Colombia and Ecuador. From Colombia, we will be participating with our colleagues from the Colombian Red Cross. Sonia Paz, manager for disaster, and she is a psychologist and specialist and has over 30 years experience in terms of food security and specifically cash and voucher assistance. She will be addressing that situation in Colombia. She will be sharing with us the experience and sharing the response that was provided at the time of Hurricane Iota. We will also go towards how the Red Cross has been working in the framework of migration and how it has been working with the social protection system. For that, we will go to Natalia Ramirez. She is a psychologist with over 7 years experience. She works with around CVAs and other life means, and she is working on those topics in Colombia. So this for the Colombian experience, two different examples, two very short and simple presentations. From Ecuador, we will have our friends from HIAS Ecuador, Karen Cordova, Senior Coordinator for Economic Inclusion, and also Daniela Navas Perrone as an Officer for Economic Inclusion from UNHCR Ecuador. They will be talking about the different models that they use and how they work in Ecuador and how they're dealing with the phenomenon of migration coming in from Venezuela. They will have a very potent example in terms of this framework and the use of CVAs as a tool. So let's begin with the Colombian example. Sonia, welcome. You have the floor.
Gracias, Diego. Un saludo cordial para todos. Bueno, la
Thank
idea
you so much, Diego. Greetings. The idea is to indeed let everyone know about our experience with Hurricane Iota in Colombia. Our response in the face of this emergency in the San Andrés Islas archipelago. So as you can see, we are located in the northern part of the islands of Providencia, Santa Catalina, and San Andres. Those were located in the region that was most impacted by Hurricane Iota, a Category 5 hurricane. For the first time in history, we had a Category 5 hurricane impacting these small islands drastically. It was especially an impact in terms of infrastructure. We are thinking that over 90% of the infrastructure was impacted. We're talking about a region, the main economic activity, where the main economic activity has to do with tourism. So we covered San Andres, Santa Catalina, and Providencia. And in the next slide, we can see a bit more information about the population in this region. In San Andres, 1,915 people. In Providencia, 3,716 people suffered impacts. We had assessments of households, and in San Andres, there were 2,514 homes impacted and 1976 in Providencia. We are part of the National Disaster Response System, and so we go through a whole process of preparing for this situation, for responding. So our national coordination is the center, is the headquarter of all of our efforts, and we begin with institutional coordination led by the National Disaster Management Network. We participated and we took into account the international community, organizations such as firemen, civil defense, military corps, etc., especially when it came to access to the region, that it became very difficult. So civil society organizations and also government and donors who added their efforts to our response plan in that space for the PMU. Puesto de Mando Unificado, a unified command center, which is located in Bogota. It has its headquarters in Bogota, but had an office in Providencia and San Andres for those purposes. When it comes to the departmental councils for disaster management, we worked with the local municipalities and local governments to be able to coordinate in terms of our humanitarian response. And this is where the Colombian Red Cross went to work with 9 action lines. So CVA, and after assessing the situation and the impact on financial service providers, etc., we activated our multi-purpose cash and voucher assistance through a financial service providers, Heroes at that time, which allowed us to be able to provide these families who had suffered the impact of the hurricane with this assistance. So we designed the entire program based on those transfers and cash assistance. In this process of coordination for the response purpose, we also use that same space to from the PMU to start organizing that plan for an early recovery and a long-term recovery as well. There were many challenges in terms of access, logistics, pricing on the islands that that guard and led us to work overtime at that moment. But when it comes to recovery, I'd like to really emphasize that we worked a lot with government entities and civil society, and we connected with the Chamber of Commerce actually back then and the Department of Labor through Impulsa to identify the different impacts of the ways of life for these communities. We started to work with these institutions to see where we could bring things to the table to provide things, provide resources as well for the recovery of those ways of lives of life of the families that had suffered an impact. So we worked with these government entities through this protection system. We started to go over what kind of impact they had suffered, what were the amounts required, what were the needs, and we started to map out the different institutions that were working along these lines. And we took over those business units that weren't formal or legalized, for example, and we analyze how to contribute. We worked in coordination with this government institution. We have here a few pictures of the processes we worked on with the agricultural and fisheries systems. This also implied a technical accompaniment program and establishing a business plan so that we could identify those amounts that we needed to cover through transfer and supplies. Here we identify the different programs that we worked on. We addressed issues with government, and we participated with them in the activation of this plan. We worked with these families through that registry for victims of the hurricane, and we started to address the issue of technical assistance. We connected with the system through our national learning system, and we managed to capitalize on that. You can see here the amounts that we provided to each beneficiary, among other things. We've highlighted these efforts and the importance of working on preparation.
Poder establecer ciertos estudios, fortalecimiento de
Being
capacidades.
able to have a contingency plan and to be able to set all of these actions in motion to respond.
Atenta a las preguntas. Gracias, Diego.
That would be all on my part. Thank you, Diego.
Natalia, ¿no se escucha?
We can't hear you. I believe you're on mute.
Se te escucha muy lejos.
Hola, ¿me escuchan?
Mucho mejor. Adelante.
Nuevamente, hola a todos. Bueno, en esta oportunidad tengo el
Once
gusto
again, hello everyone. I have a pleasure of sharing with you the response of the Colombian Red Cross in terms of the migration phenomenon coming from Venezuela. We have identified two windows of opportunity. Next slide, please. Next. In this case, well, this is the response that the Colombian Red Cross has provided in terms of the migration crisis coming from Venezuela. We've identified two windows of opportunity. These are both aligned to a government strategy at a domestic level to integrate Venezuelan migrants based on a protection for migrants, which is an additional mechanism to the international protection regime that already existed in the country. This seeks to make more flexible the permanence of migrants in our country and moving from temporary protection to a regular protection mechanism. and eventually be able to become a legal resident.
De protección temporal, al cual pues los
This
migrantes
is done through a temporary permit that migrants have access to through a process of registration in Colombian migration offices. Uh, Among the requirements, well, there are several administrative requirements, but um, through this process, they will get the permit and they get access to one, mechanisms for social protection, and as a consequence for two government social programs and healthcare system, and to the formal labor market, which is something that could potentially guarantee and a part of a registration in the pension system. So we see here greater impact that is favorable, and this has helped migrants become constituents and taxpayers. Now, the Red Cross has different centers at national level that provide intersectorial help to vulnerable sectors of the population, not only migrants, but they do focus on this sector as well. So, with the transition in the migration context, there was an emergency response provided more based on integration, and there we used CVAs through channels for liaising with the social protection system. For example, when it comes to cash and voucher assistance, we sought to satisfy the basic needs of each household with the provision of between 350 to $540, this depending on national standards and the number of members of each family nucleus. And there we give them prepaid cards or transfers. So this accompaniment lasts about 4 months. Even though that transfer is not conditioned to any kind of activity, there are additional actions generated based on the interests that will contribute realization of these households. So if the family seeks to remain in our territory and still is not going through the regularization process, then we help them so that they can have access to that mechanism. And with the setting up of these centers, um, we created partnerships with Migration Colombia, which is responsible of implementing these statutes and programs.
en Magdalena, el punto visible de
For
migración
example, in our offices in Magdalena, the visible point was located at the Red Cross. The visible points are our different liaison offices. So with that, we managed to go through a joint and bidirectional process. Um, if they already have a permit for temporary residence but are not yet included in social welfare or social protection programs, then we will help them do that through different programs such as Cisbena in Colombia, which classifies the members of the population depending on their income and situation. Therefore, they are categorized into people who can have access to these programs. So the profiles that are the most in need are usually elderly, people with disability, caregivers, children, etc. So CISBEN has benefited not only migrants, but also people, Colombian nationals. If they're a specific need, they will move to a location to provide a more integral, more holistic approach. Also, if there are people who are interested in employment, they will have access to different amounts and different kinds of resources because they could be tied to training expenses or supporting them during that first month of labor to provide them with the necessary supplies to survive. So all of these efforts, among others, that can favor their participation in the labor market so that that person can also become a part of the social security system. Next slide, please.
Bien. Entre otros elementos que fortalecen la intervención, pues se resalta también la instalación de
Among
mecanismos.
other elements that strengthen this intervention, we have communication and further participation, interviews, satisfaction surveys, as well as a phone number to address any contact. And there's also a tool for prioritization and focusing on the different needs based on vulnerability criteria. There's also a process for providing feedback through participants so that we can analyze and recognize these best practices and areas for improvement. So all of these actions are additional and complement each other. And also, well, the Red Cross conducts self-evaluation and learning exercises when it comes to safety so that we can keep strengthening these activities. Finally, we would like to share one of our success cases, success phases with you. One Venezuelan participant, a nurse, who came into one of our centers. She went to Colombia and she was not regularized, so she could not get her degree validation in Colombia. So she started working in other areas, mainly cleaning houses, and that was not enough to cover all of the needs for her household. So we accompanied her, managed to get her regularized in terms of a migration status. And through the CVAs, she managed to get her degree validated. And she also participated in different activities that were conducted with the training entity for the Colombian state, therefore managing to get her formally hired in a state healthcare institution. Natalia, Sonia, thank you so much for your presentation. I'd like to leave you with some key elements in terms of both presentations. They both take into account the strength of the liaising in each situation. When it comes to Hurricane Iota in northern Colombia, you can see that an institutional coordination process was generated with all social sectors. It is aligned with what we could say was the theory of social protection based on a unified data system through a sole registry of people affected for purposes of a CBA. We also must take into account that there was a horizontal expansion, if I can say that it that way, when we addressed CVAs, and once we had the participation of the government and the Red Cross, we managed to do that expansion between the government and the Red Cross through the design of programs. They agreed on a duration for those programs and also processes for eligibility, which is also something very significant. As you can see since the beginning of the presentation, we insist on that. And then long-term recovery processes, as Sonia was mentioning with these projects. When it comes to migration, there are several elements to take into account. First, something that is quite evident in terms of the existing legal frameworks in Colombia and how in that way there could be coordination between government and cooperation agencies to allow for the implementation of programs and manage cases through these different centers or offices called CAOs. As you see in the pictures, they also have the approval, the from the national government. These kinds of centers address the situation of CVA for assistance purposes, but also in terms of the accompaniment towards economic inclusion long term. And finally, finalizing the programs that seek to obtain sustainability, considering the cycles of social protection systems. These people usually come in directly to becoming taxpayers when we have a success case such as that of Natalia. Thank you so much for the Colombian intervention. Let's go to Ecuador with Karen and Daniela. I really hope that more people could share their success cases and their models. Karen, welcome. You have the floor.
Muchísimas gracias, Diego. Muy buenos días con todos y todas. Efectivamente, vamos a estar
Good
acompañando
morning, everyone.
Daniela, oficial de medios de vida de ACNUR en
I
Ecuador.
am Daniela Navas from UNHCR Ecuador, and I am here representing HIAS.
Tenemos este programa y también en otros
I'd like to say a few words about the country and how we're working on this program and how we saw the
multiplicar el impacto.
CVA potential to multiply its impact. First, I'd like to mention that Ecuador is home to over 500,000 Venezuelan nationals, and almost 40% of their population are living through multidimensional poverty.
Y que nos encontramos en una etapa de desaceleración de la economía.
We find ourselves in economic deceleration right now, so that adds to the complexity of the situation.
Se activaron los diferentes lineamientos.
We have activated the different guidelines and axes.
Entre ellos, el alivio de la pobreza,
Among them, poverty release, relief, self-employment, employment, and financial inclusion. All of this, along with 4 additional areas for economic inclusion that have a protection and development approach. There's gender-based prevention and food security, among others. With these 5 areas, we activate them to be able to implement the model. To understand the system, I'd like to present the model itself first. We're talking about a program that mainly focuses on the on poverty relief. This was designed in 2015 based on a pilot program in Ecuador, and it is a program to support families in situations of human vulnerability and mobility. We accompany them for 18 to 24 months. And what do we work on for measurement purposes? There are 4 criteria. One is food security. With this accompaniment, from training to counseling and access to monetary to CVAs, these families can have access to nutrition and feed themselves at least 3 times a day. With sustainable means of life, they can count on a specific income to address their basic needs. Savings. So that is accompaniment towards financial inclusion until they have access to financial products in the market. We want them to save at least 5% of their income to mitigate risks for at least the last 6 months of the program. And finally, support networks that looks for integration in a way that the family can participate actively and sustainably in different activities so that they can activate their circles.
This project implemented by HIAS has certain characteristics that can be applied to the Accompany project with the family that I wish to address. This project is a strategy designed by the government of Ecuador to accompany those families that are in extreme poverty. The family unit is the same one in both programs, and the objective is quite linked. Specifically, the family accompaniment project in its technical regulation wishes to handle 5 dimensions. Now, these dimensions are, first of all, the identity. In other words, the members of the family need to have a document that is provided by the civil authority in Ecuador. Health is to be able to have access to a health card, which will allow them to carry out the follow-up and monitoring of the health conditions of each one of the family members. Education, especially, this is linked to eradicate child labor. In other words, all children, boys, girls, and adolescents in schooling have to have access to education. Economic inclusion, this can be promoted to have access to employment and wages, and a family dynamic, which is having access to integral protection of all the members of the family group. And this was presented by the government through a technical standard for the family accompaniment project. But of course, we faced many challenges to link the dimensions found in the protection axis, as well as those more related to lifestyles and economic circumstances. This is why the harmonization of these cash and voucher assistance were necessary. How did we see all of this? During the preparation stage, there was a design stage where we the different methodologies, and we identified which are the convergence items. One of the most important ones, as I said before, is that the intervention unit is the same one. It's the family. Secondly, is the territory where the provinces were implemented could also coincide. And the third one is that both programs search for the same thing, to mitigate poverty and extreme poverty. And here we also can see the methods that are followed, where we defined tools and methods. We had feedback at a local and national level on how this harmonization might take place. And also there was a coordination through technical tables where there were analysis committees concerning the local cases, and a national interagency committee where not only did we sit down with the state and the others, actors, like, for example, the municipalities, academy, UNHCR, and agencies with participants from other agencies, and also the response stage where we everything that was prepared. And here, training was extremely relevant for the teams and the delivery of services and follow-up. Why training of teams? Because HIAS activated their technical team made up by professionals guided towards the business perspective, but also professionals guided towards social perspectives, social workers, psychologists that accompanied each one of these families. And this analysis amongst the technical team transferred to the Ministry of Social Inclusion and Social Inclusion as well. After that analysis, we realized and we were able to define the proper methodology. First of all, the Human Development Bonus of Ecuador is issued for a specific period of time based on the closing strategy, while the consumption bonus of HIAS concerning the different levels has a characteristic of being downwards. In other words, the first amount has to be greater up to the 6th month in a consecutive manner, and after the 7th month, scaling monthly on a monthly basis to avoid the generation of dependencies. Yes, of course, complementing it with the capabilities that could be strengthened within a family nucleus. And what we see here is the specific harmonization concerning the support of consumption and the variable human development bonus, where we were able to harmonize the methodology that the Ministry of Social Inclusion has, and to complement it with the highest focus and the UNHCR. And the basis of this human bonus was $50 as it's kept at present, and a differentiation for children, boys, girls, and adolescents, depending on their age and the number of children which are part of that household. And here we defined it as a bonus concerning the variable human bonus based on this $50. It could reach up to $150 depending on the specific characteristics. Now, the frequency is monthly, and for a 12-month period through the same mechanism for Ecuadorian individual as those under mobility. This was not the only component of a cash and voucher assistance that was harmonized, but also that destined to those individuals that had house members in their household which received monetary transfers, as they call it, the business incubation component. Here, the cash and voucher assistance was a mechanism. It was necessarily to understand the incubate their business. The first thing is to identify the profile through the scanning of the capabilities that that individual has, specifically the adults in that household, to understand which are the strategies that you can guide that individual. If it's wages, specific wages for that individual, or the entrepreneurship, or the capability concerning the employment levels and financial inclusion. These are the three axes that I mentioned before. And thereafter, the transfer of assets, where we see the component of monetary transfers through the seed capital, but also through cash and voucher assistance and technical assistance, where we search for supported agencies from the Ecuadorian government that can issue a certificate. It's the capabilities of these individuals or the proper training to strengthen the capabilities that are needed in the market, and a follow-up. It's a monitoring plan and an accompanying one as well. We defined a single amount for the Ecuadorian families and human mobility as well of $500. This single amount was delivered on one single occasion within this program, with the same mechanism concerning this variable consumption bonus that I spoke about before, and it's called seed capital. Why is it important to harmonize this cash and voucher assistance program? First of all, because HIAS implemented the specific amounts, and we were able to generate more support. Why Venezuelans receive more? Why Ecuadorians receive more? Well, Daniela will be addressing this topic and the impact, and which were the lessons learned concerning this. Thank you, Karen. We've gone beyond the allotted time. Just 5 important items to be able to complement what Karen has just said. First of all, here we can clearly see the humanitarian development nexus, what was said at the start. This is a response to alleviate poverty. It takes care, basically, people under poverty circumstances at high, seeing the people that are receiving this monetary assistance during the first stages of this humanitarian response. These can be focused towards these types of interventions, which are intensive in time and accompaniment. Secondly, the leadership of the state, especially the ministry mentioned here of 150 families, and how the leadership of this agency promoted the adaptation and harmonization of a parallel alignment of what we had before concerning this bonus. This parallel alignment of the social protection systems went through a harmonization of these amounts so as to be able to take care of individuals with these deliveries and the delivery of services. These cash and voucher assistance is not the ultimate objective for this specific case, but also to be able to create self-sufficiency in these families, to have access to universal services. In other words, the refugee families are part of this together with the Equatorial families, the families who receives this assistance. Both families will be receiving these cash assistances. The Ecuadorian families receive this from the Ecuadorian state, and the other families through HIAS and the UNHCR. They will have care services, education, and understand which are the channels or how to circulate through these social services, and also an intensive accompaniment concerning economic inclusion. Now, the third super important aspect is that the graduation model through these cash assistance systems is to intensify deliveries at the start, and thereafter they're intermittent until they're retired fully. Accompaniment continues, it's by proxy, and thereafter an accompanied for the family to have sufficient resiliency when the support is removed and they're ready to be able to obtain their own income based on their economic activities. And this does not take place with Ecuadorian families because they will continue receiving these cash assistances. And this can, of course, create issues concerning the co-responsibility of these families to respond to certain graduation criteria, as Karen was talking about. And the fourth aspect is the focalization and management system for information. With this project, what we did with the refugee families and Ecuadorian families, they had to be registered in the social registry system of the country, and the targeting was the same one. And this is very important as well. And also the management information system, we do not create a parallel system. In other words, the families were monitored within the same state system, the accompaniment service from the ministry. And colloquially, merely to give you an example, all the personnel dedicated in this project was hired through the ministry, and this generated evidences, very specific evidence, how a harmonization of these systems concerning the deliveries can be translated into an early stage in a parallel alignment of this social protection system with the goal in mind to amplify it horizontally. In other words, the state to be in charge of the refugee families within these protection system, and for us to remove this little by little and sufficient evidence that from this at a state level to consider the population or those families in poverty and migrants after this pilot. So we created management concerning human mobility available to provide this specialized attention to these different families. Important thing that I had to say. Thank you. Let's continue with our panel. Thank you, Daniela, and thank you, Karen, kindly for your lectures. I believe that you conveyed interesting things. I was going to summarize your presentations, but I believe that Daniela did this very well, so we can continue. Let me say two specific things. First of all, to the speakers, those of you in the Q&A session, there are questions addressed to you. There is one for highest to Ecuador. You can answer concerning the calculation of the basic basket.
Tipo de condicionalidad también que la vienen haciendo.
Others are reciprocity. Richard is asking this question addressed to you. In other words, what would motivate you to let you know? Oh, in other words, Colombia and Ecuador, please answer this question concerning the basic basket. On our behalf, we wish to convey an additional question for you to answer it, especially it has to do with what we're addressing at present during this second part of the panel, much linked to what has to do with the response beyond the early responses, is to specifically ask you. I believe that Sonia and Daniela can be the people that can answer this question. In other words, which are the links to social protection are more relevant concerning the experiences that we have seen in Colombia and Ecuador, because there are different links that you can find. In other words, where do you find a tool concerning this cash and voucher assistance tools? What is the most relevant that you wish to underscore and say, I'll take this away, or based on your experiences? Let's begin with you, Sonia, and thereafter, Daniela. Well, thank you. The most relevant is talking about the YODA. The main connection that we have identified has to do with socioeconomic recovery. The means, life means to guarantee precisely community resilience, the linkage, the recovery, the rethinking of the improvement systems concerning the strengthening of capabilities through the systems offered by the government, through the learning services, technical advice, participation in different events, which will allow the communities an early recovery so as to be able to generate sustenance concerning the main achievements that we consider as the nexus towards social protection. I believe that it has to do with any type of emergency. All of this is crucial concerning this liaison towards economic stability. And this is seen in the response before these emergency responses of IOTA. And as Natalia was saying with regards to the migratory issue, there's also a strong link when we were talking about the process of migrants in transit and initially how they're identified and they're connected to the supply in the country. And to generate this link in terms of orientation, documentation, which will allow the population to start carrying out their transit, but it also provides possibilities to those families that are located and decide to establish themselves in Colombia. And of course, we connect that to lifestyles, which is crucial for their stability in the territory. Well, thank you, especially with what you were talking about, the agreement with the government for it not to only to be the but also to connect, because life means implies that from a social policy, government social policy perspective. And Daniela, what is your perspective? Two key ideas. We always need to think in an exit strategy. And here the graduation method provides the sufficient leads to understand that what does the family need? It needs psychosocial accompaniment, economic accompaniment, so that we might provide them with a pathway towards self-sufficiency routes. And this, first of all. Secondly, there's much pressure from the states to fund these cash and voucher assistance systems and their social security systems. And this is what happened in Ecuador. But we're doing well with this pilot, creating evidence of this back in 2019. But through the executive decree, limited the reception of these cash assistance in Ecuador. So there's been a stumbling in continuing with this alignment and with work towards access to the rights of populations in Ecuador. However, there are actors which have been crucial. In other words, we need to understand near with the multilateral, the World Bank, which are mainly the financiers concerning the social protection systems, and they might, through coordinated work, to look towards or to help out towards the design of these different projects concerning the funding of these social protection systems for refugees and migrants, and also funding the fiduciary fund handled by the World Bank destined to refugees and other funding mechanisms that worked together with the multilateral agencies. These might be seen as an opportunity from a state level and not as a burden for the migrant refugees concerning these social protection systems. Very well, thanks. And based on what you said and what Amaya insisted at the start of the meeting, to be concerned once again concerning this nexus with humanitarian towards development, and how can we start seeing other multilateral stakeholders that are thinking, especially from a development perspective, strengthening the social protection systems and to find links with what you're doing. And as Maya was saying at the start, yes, of course, the need of cash and voucher assistance, but in other occasions, promoting people for them to have this guarantee in terms of survival and for these people to be able to transit towards different development areas. Thank you, Daniela, for your intervention. And with this, we shall close the second module of today's session, which was on responses fully. So we wanted examples from Colombia and Ecuador. Of course, we shall be sharing everything with you. And for the time being, before ending with the session, we shall give the floor to my colleague for a summary of everything that we have addressed today. And thereafter, we shall be closing this event. Holly, you have the world. Super. I believe that we have heard all the presentations. I have 10 items. What we have heard at present. First of all, it's a very long process concerning early answers, and coordination is another. We heard this from Colombia, from the Philippines, what we were able to hear. And on the other hand, we need to involve the different stakeholders, donors, humanitarian actors, NGOs, but also from different government agencies, social protection, civil protection agencies, data agencies, technical tables from the Ecuador group, and fourth, volunteer. This is a coordination aspect. We have to deliver this, and this is something very important. Fifth, funding. How and whom? And this was mentioned in the different presentations. Number 6, to have this single registry. We've heard about this from Colombia, Dominican Republic, and the Philippines. This is an ambitious process and long process as well, but it helps us to carry out early actions and response. And 7th, reparation. We have heard up to now. It's important to strengthen the capabilities of the different teams. We spoke about this in the presentations from Ecuador and Colombia. Number 8, the agreements between the different actors concerning the cash and voucher assistance methods, the operative methods, eligibility of individuals, and harmonization of the amounts in certain cases, and particularly the cases we have heard from people in movement, human mobility. This is very important. And lastly, evidence and experiences that we have give us a northern star towards the future to understand how to improve the processes and continually improve. And this is what we heard today. Mamaya, you have the floor now. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a very interesting journey today. Thank you, Diego, for guiding us throughout this journey among the different countries in our region. We went from the Caribbean. We heard the experience of the Dominican Republic. We went to Ecuador, to Colombia. We went to other regions. We heard the experience of the Philippines, taking care of the emergencies through the typhoons, and recommendations very useful in our region. And Holly, I thought of 5 issues which were key to me. I believe that all panelists do coincide in these aspects. And you have spoken about this with regards to your 10 items. I spoke about these 5 items. I learned much personally, and I remembered many things that maybe I forgot. So yes, this pathway was extremely interesting. This learning space, sharing experiences amongst all of us. I believe that this is extremely useful, and work continues, dear colleagues. This is a long journey. We have been asked to be patient. This is a mid and long-term work. And for us, what we need to continue doing is facilitating these dialogue spaces, learning spaces, spaces to share experiences amongst the different stakeholders that work here. There are many stakeholders. They need to work together in a coordinated manner. Therefore, we shall try to organize spaces like this to talk about our challenges amongst us and what we consider that we're doing well concerning this link towards social protection. As I said, this is the second of these 3 days that we're organizing concerning learning. So we wish to end simply by promoting the next learning space that will take place on Thursday, on the 20th. We will also have a 2-hour space from 10 to 12 a.m. Panama time to talk about experiences linked to social protection topics and recovery. In other words, we're going to close the cycle that you can see on the screen. First of all, we spoke about prevention, to be prepared, thereafter response today, and the third day, we shall try to close this cycle with the recovery objective concerning exit strategies, the link concerning development subject matters, and transiting little by little to the long-term inclusion. Dear colleagues, you're all invited to this third learning day. With no further ado, I wish to thank the organizers of this learning cycle. Thank you to the CASCAP project, Jimena, with you, to the PMA colleagues, to the movement of the Red Cross and the different domestic agencies, CaLP, together with you, Holly, Diego, Juliana, Save the Children, UNICEF, and all of you for having participated here today. Well, thank you. Thank you to all of you. You will receive further information concerning this webinar, the link to listen to it, to share it with other colleagues, and the presentations. So once again, thank you very much, and surely we shall continue in touch in next events. Things continue. Thank you all, and have a great day. See you soon. Greetings.